Mothers and Daughters, which ran between issues 151 and 200, is normally split into 4 parts: Flight, Women, Reads, and Minds. The titles of the final 3 parts are intended to be a subtle message to the readers. That message being, women read minds. The validity of that message is open to interpretation. Overall, this storyline cleans up and brings a soft resolution to all the elements, narrative threads, and nearly all the characters that were established during the series. For all intents and purposes, this is where the saga of Cerebus ends. The life of Cerebus continues, but the epic story that began in high society comes to a reasonably definitive conclusion. While the story is convoluted, shifting its focus between multiple characters and settings, the plot is somewhat straightforward. Cerebus starts an uprising to oust the occupational Cyrenus force. When Cerebus mysteriously disappears to have a conversation with Suentus Poe, the Roach takes control of the situation and keeps the Cyrenists in check. Meanwhile, Astoria makes her way unopposed to Cyren's location. Cyren and Astoria are joined by Cerebus, where they are all given a speech by Suentus Poe. Poe gives these main players the historical information they may be lacking and urges them to abandon their quest for power. Having said his piece, Poe leaves and suggests all the other members do the same. Astoria takes this advice, leaving Cerebus and Cyren to battle one another. This battle triggers another ascension. Cerebus and Cyren are split apart as they ascend into space and begin a tour of the solar system. During this tour, both characters are given insights by the creator, Dave. However, the focus remains on Cerebus. Dave shows Cerebus the folly of his ways. He unsuccessfully attempts to educate Cerebus and get him to acknowledge his quest for wealth and power is a fool's journey. Cerebus repents, but Dave knows what's truly in Cerebus's heart and mind. He knows Cerebus is only telling him what he believes in that moment, but fundamentally, Cerebus remains unchanged. So, Dave strands his creation on Pluto to reflect on his terrible life and the equally terrible choices he's made. Eventually, after hearing his character be genuinely remorseful, Dave relents and returns Cerebus to Earth. As mentioned at the beginning, this epic storyline brings the majority of the Cerebus saga to an end. The series could have actually stopped at this point, although it hadn't reached the promised ending where the lead character dies. That being said, Cerebus could have remained in limbo, exiled on Pluto. He could have remained where he was alive, but he would have been perceived, for all intents and purposes, as functionally dead. Dead in the sense that he was no longer useful and his story was over. Certainly, it might not have been a satisfying conclusion, but the remaining portion of the series doesn't provide the closure one might anticipate. While some characters, such as Elrod and the Regency Elf, are given an origin and an explanation for their disappearance, many others are not. For the most part, all the side characters, with the exception of Jaka, Rick, and Bear, suddenly vanish from the series. This is not an exaggeration. The supporting cast seen in the prior 200 issues literally stop existing and they are never seen again. In other words, the stage is reset. The setting and the circumstances remain in place, but the series takes a slight turn into a more grounded approach. Put another way, there's a change in direction with continuity in place. However, the focus becomes quite different. As a reader, one naturally expects the series to continue along a new but familiar path. Instead, it moves forward into an elaboration of the point of view Sim developed during the Read segment. Essentially, for the next 100 issues, Cerebus examines Sim's perception of the influence of women on society, and finally, near the end of the series, his interpretation of various religious texts. Speaking of reads, I've already done an in-depth video dedicated to that segment, so I won't be getting into it here. Except to say, for the purposes of reading or rereading Cerebus, one can skip all the text bits of reads and not miss any important details. It is, very literally, an irrelevant deviation. The text portions are only relevant if you plan on reading Cerebus past issue 200. So, if you want to skip the veiled portrayal of publishing comics in the 80s and 90s, as well as the overly long, forced metaphor examining the alleged parasitic nature of women, then you can do so and not miss anything worthwhile. In fact, it's what I recommend. Of course, it has to be acknowledged that Reed's is a significant turning point for the series. That segment, and Sim's elaboration in the final 100 issues, effectively ended his comic book career. It also destroyed any possible legacy the Cerebus series might have attained. Again, I would direct you to the video dedicated to that segment for further details. There's one final point that I left out of that Reed's video because it was more suitable in this one. During Reed's, Sim does announce that Cerebus will end with issue 200. He retracts that statement within the same issue number 183 to be precise. However, he does leave doubt in the reader's mind as to whether he's joking or not. This is a highly overlooked and underexamined piece of information, mainly because it's overshadowed by what's revealed in the anti-feminist issue a few months later. In my opinion, this insert actually reveals Cerebus does come to a close at issue 200. Sim knew where he was going to take the series after Mothers and Daughters, and he also knew that everything he was currently doing was an effort to clear the stage for that direction. So he was, spiritually, ending the series. The comic would continue, but the series of events that had begun in 1980 were being wrapped up in 1995. The key to all the events is the knowledge that Cerebus, the character, acts as a lens that enhances magic. This enhancement was responsible for bringing Elrod back to life and for creating the Regency Elf, among many other examples. Magical objects seen throughout the series are briefly highlighted as they seemingly come to life and then return to their previous inert state, now completely drained of magic. Narratively, they have served their purpose. Moving forward, they are irrelevant and unnecessary. Therefore, they are shown to disappear, either literally or figuratively. The overall narrative focus is attempting to break the chain of events that have repeated throughout the history of Cerebus' world. Suentus Poe remembers these events, and it's implied he's either been an active participant or passive witness to this historical repetition. It always ends with a few individuals vying for power and then attempting to ascend. This quest always ends in failure, destruction, and the loss of many lives. Like with any epic story, where the foundation is a conflict that repeats, Cerebus is about the final conflict. This is where the cycle is broken. Another unnecessary element in regards to the series moving forward is the majority of the supporting cast. As mentioned a moment ago, with the exception of 3 characters, everyone else disappears. To be completely accurate, Mick and Keith do have minor appearances in Guy's. Thatcher also appears as an antagonist in Guy's and Rick's story. She's a narrative necessity more than anything. In part, Lord Julius not being seen again makes sense. After all, he's mainly a political figure, and the story doesn't veer in that direction again. He also adds a level of absurdity that would be a distraction to the tone Sim will later establish. The Roach simply sliding out of view, never to be seen again, is odd. In fact, the Roach's entire arc during this portion doesn't appear to have a point. Certainly, it's satirizing certain popular comics of the era, but that's about it. It's just a series of ridiculous segues because the Roach is a ridiculous character. And this is a subplot that's abandoned when it's no longer necessary. Admittedly, that's a touch too dismissive. The Roach is, somehow, attempting to keep the conversation between Siren, Cerebus, and Astoria peaceful, so he does serve a purpose. And when that purpose is served, he's gone and completely forgotten. Which does speak to the thread of magical objects disappearing, since, during this arc, the Roach must be using magic to keep everyone sedated. But, like some other revelations, this sudden magical ability has not been previously established or suggested. Siren never appearing again is highly perplexing. As a key figure, one that was integral to the evolution of the storyline, it would be expected she'd appear at some future point. However, one could argue that Siren's story was complete at the end of Mothers and Daughters, and further involvement wasn't necessary. By the end, we fully understand her beginnings and her motivation. Furthermore, Siren is mollified when she learns that Cerebus, who is revealed to be a hermaphrodite, cannot give birth. He is neutered, so to speak. This information was of great concern to her, because if Cerebus can give birth, then he's on an equal plane with Siren, and that would undermine her religious principles. After all, the ability to give birth is a sacred act, and the foundation of her religion in many ways. So Cerebus having that capability is something Siren cannot accept or allow. Within context, Siren does get character closure once she obtains the knowledge that Cerebus is barren. He becomes, in her eyes, just another useless man, not a threat. For the record, Cerebus being a hermaphrodite comes out of nowhere. Although Sim has stated that he is known, Cerebus had these characteristics from the beginning. As far as one can tell, if this is true, he did nothing to seed this plot point before that big reveal. All of these characters and plot threads not being addressed does give one the impression that the overall plot may have been worked out years ago, but it was always in flux. There may have been a grand design, but it was a very rough sketch at best. The specifics were broad strokes, and many details were ambiguous. And finally, the story was subject to the whims and the personal development of the creator, Dave Sim. Again, this becomes apparent during this series of events and the final 100 issues. Of all the Cerebus volumes, Mothers and Daughters is the least organic. From beginning to end, the hand of the creator is obviously guiding the series in a specific direction. This begins with Cerebus' sudden disappearance and entry into the Seventh Sphere. It's an act that contradicts previously established entries, where his body remains in the world, but his mind travels into the ethereal, higher realm. This isn't an attempt to be a continuity cop, but to point out that to get Cerebus where he needed him to be, Sim had to intervene. So he literally removes the character from the world and puts him somewhere else. The ascension also just happens. The pre-established rules, so to speak, were completely thrown out and ignored. Instead, it happens because Sim needs to separate Siren and Cerebus and resolve this conflict. Furthermore, Suentus Poe is Sim's mouthpiece until the narrative gets to a point where he has to step in and take over. This direct intervention, the tour of the solar system, is a deep dive into all the story pieces Sim either withheld or couldn't insert organically. It's all the parts that were necessary to reveal in order to give the reader a sense of closure. Finally, once that closure is obtained, Sim literally drops Cerebus where he needs him to be, so the final third of the series can begin. While this direct intervention somewhat works, it also has the appearance of a creator wanting to simply finish a story and move on. This isn't intended to suggest creative laziness, although critically speaking, that wouldn't be an invalid point. My intent is to point out that, at more than a few points, the only way to move the story forward was through direct intervention. One could suggest a degree of hubris because Sim takes on the role of the omnipotent narrator instead of using a fictional, established god, such as Taram, to accomplish the same thing. This would have made sense. However, looking at where the series develops, this part of the saga merges Sim and his views as subtext within the series itself. And once Sim is properly written into the main narrative, he never leaves. Even though technically, he is rarely seen again. Reed's was the first step in this process, and Mind's was the final step of this merger. That is why Sim takes on the god role. It's so he becomes an overt but rarely seen part of the Cerebus story. Of course, this all feeds into the prior, joking announcement that Cerebus ends with issue 200. With all this context, it's difficult not to conclude that Cerebus does have a soft conclusion in order to change direction. Gone is the pretense this is an organically told, fictional story about an aardvark. By issue 200, the series has now evolved into something else. It's a different reality, one could argue. But really, it's a series where the viewpoint has shifted from examining social themes, as seen in high society through church and state, to presenting a solution to those issues. I have to step in briefly and give some proper credit. The valuable insight that Sim goes from examining issues to trying to solve them came from the YouTube channel Living the Line. This is a point I wouldn't have arrived at on my own, but I couldn't ignore it or not acknowledge the source once I heard it. Because, in my opinion, it's very relevant to the future of the series. Since I've already inserted myself into this video, I might as well remain here for a minute. Some may wonder if I intend to do the remainder of the series. After all, I've done in-depth coverage of 2/3 of the series. Why not go to the end? The reason I intend to stop at this point is because I see no critical value in continuing. Let me explain that. From this point forward, the series is all about Sim elaborating on his anti-feminist stance. The series becomes less about telling a compelling, fictional story, and more about Sim making a bunch of interrelated observations using his monthly comic book as a platform. Certainly, there is an outstanding level of craft in the forthcoming material, that is undeniable, but the message being projected becomes louder and louder. It gets to a point where it overwhelms the material. In my opinion, this culminates in the Going Home arc, where a straw-filled version of Jaka journeys with Cerebus to his homeland. It's painful to see a fully realized, empathetic character become a manipulated instrument of the creator's point of view. From there, the series spirals even deeper into self-indulgent pockets of religiosity and fanaticism. Some may enjoy this descent, but I find it pedantic and lacking any insight. It's just a bunch of words with some nice illustrations. Many people have difficulty with the entire series, rather than a specific portion of it. Specifically, the reads portion and much of what follows. And that's very understandable. Separating the art from the artist is a difficult thing to do, especially when the creator is expressing a highly disagreeable, reductive opinion. This is further exacerbated by the fact that Sim's views demonstrably impact the series after issue 200. So, financially supporting someone, even for an earlier period where those views aren't present, is abhorrent for most. Again, that's understandable. Nowadays, I believe Cerebus is avoided because it has this legendary, controversial status. And, in part, that status is well earned. But I hope through this series of videos, you can understand the context and importance of the series before Reads was published and why there was such a severe reaction to it. I mean, in conjunction with the ridiculous opinion Sim expressed. None of this is a justification or reconciliation with that ridiculous opinion, nor an attempt to validate that opinion with objective reasoning and a critical evaluation of everything around it. That bears repeating. There is a history worth documenting. Additionally, there is worth in documenting the objectionable parts along with the achievements. It may be unpleasant to acknowledge, but Cerebus was once an important, influential title. When it fell hard, and it fell fast. But before then, it was on its way to becoming a masterpiece. Some may argue, despite its fall from grace, that it's still a masterpiece. Personally, I would disagree, because, in my opinion, the totality of the work needs to be evaluated to achieve that status. And while there is certainly a high degree of craft, a full third of the series is flawed. But that's my opinion. Yours may differ. With that in mind, this series has been a look at a title with humble beginnings that rose to a place of prominence in the developing direct market. It contained interesting stories and solid visuals that became an example of the best aspects of graphic storytelling. Then it became overwhelmed with self-indulgence, and it evolved into a pitiful, overwritten thing seen in comic stores from month to month. It sat alone in its own corner, as it had previously, but now it was a thing with a legacy of disgrace, rather than a very fine example of what the medium could accomplish. Thank you for watching, or listening, whatever the case may be. Additional thanks to all my fine supporters on Patreon and YouTube. Please show support by subscribing, liking the video, and leaving a comment. If you'd like to go a step further, there's a link to my Patreon down below. Extra special thanks to Francis De La Cruz, John Nyux, Andrew Barton, Odin Ashcroft, Ruby St. Denis, Phil Sagan, Corey Drew, Ellis Gregor, Alexa Zernish, Brian Deaton, Johnny Lim, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient.